So the last thing I have for us to talk about today, Will, is kind of going back to what we were doing at the beginning of the year on the old foreign policy focus show and doing a COVID update. Just because it's been such a big story, and I want to focus on this aspect. I have a write up here for a reason, but I know you also covered it over at RT, and we will link to that in the show notes page. But the governor of New York, who is claiming, I guess, to be the best at handling COVID, now wants to have a 4,000 police officer task force to enforce social distancing at indoor dining establishments. So I don't know. You talk about this absurdity, and then maybe we could talk a little bit more about COVID in general.
Yeah, sure. And like, I do think, unfortunately, I think this is something we're kind of going to see more of. Like, we can kind of look forward to seeing this more in the future, that like these sort of like more like the convergence of policing and the pandemic, where you're going to have these like task forces enforcing social distancing and, mask wearing and all this stuff. I mean, we've definitely seen that already. We've seen plenty of that happening in the US, and then even like way more so overseas. If you look at like the UK and Australia, where the police will come and kick down your door over something you posted on the internet. We just saw that happen like last week quite a bit, where in Australia they had this rally they were planning where cops were coming and kicking down people's doors for promoting that march on the internet. And so unfortunately, I think that is sort of something we're going to see more of in the U.S., especially somewhere like New York, where you've had like you had a really bad outbreak. It is very ironic that Cuomo tries to sell himself as like some master COVID eradicator or something, when his state was the worst hit. They had the worst outbreak in the whole country, and partly I think because of his policies, because of the whole nursing home thing, forcing nursing homes to take COVID positive patients. He wasn't the only one.
Look at like NYC in itself, it's like one of the worst hit areas on the entire planet. This includes countries like Yemen, where we've systematically destroyed the healthcare infrastructure. This jackass had an entire the largest medical ship in the entire world brought into his port, didn't use it, and still has one of the highest levels. He's vacuums up all the equipment. He has 40,000 ventilators and all this other stuff that he never even uses, and then somehow claims victory. Is the most baffling thing I've seen, other than the fact that nobody's being like, what the hell is wrong with you? Everybody's just like going along with him, being like, oh yeah, this guy is great, he's such a good leader. What? It's obviously wrong by the data, and then all the science people claim that, oh no, he's a great leader.
Right, he's being kind of a bastard about it too. Like, if you hear how he talks about the outbreak, he just blames Trump 100%. But then if you go back to some of those old press conferences, he's often like conciliatory, being like, well, we had a good conversation with the president earlier. Like, if you go back to where the outbreak was like really bad and they were working with that he was sort of hostage to, like, he wanted to not disrespect or offend the feds to get what he needs. Right. But it seems like he got what he needed, and he still, couldn't manage. And now he's just completely blaming the entire thing on the president, which, like, whatever, fine. You can criticize Trump's pandemic response, but just to see the guy who presided over the very worst outbreak, who clearly has a role in it, to just be such like a jerk about it, like passing off the buck and all this, it's kind of ridiculous. But anyway, like you said, he's talking about setting up this in New York City specifically, setting up this social distancing enforcement task force. And I should say too that, like, I've seen some people sort of criticizing, saying that, like, he didn't specify a number. That, like, if you go back to the press call, it's not really clear, actually. It's possible he did actually say I thought he said 3,000 to 4,000, that he was suggesting the number for the task force. But some people are arguing that he just said 34,000 people in the NYPD, and he was just talking about the whole police force, just citing the whole, the whole number, just say, like, they have a lot of officers on hand that could do this. And so I don't know, there is some dispute that he actually specified a number. But we are talking about, he definitely talked about some kind of NYPD task force to enforce social distancing. Because right now in New York, indoor dining is still shut down. That they've allowed people to set up sort of like tables and stuff outside, but they're closed inside. And this has been like devastating to the New York bars and restaurant industry. Like, I think actually just last week we had a class action lawsuit where bars and restaurants in NYC are suing for $2 billion in damages, because they're just saying that, like, this we've been devastated by these government policies. And I think like over 1,000 eateries have gone down. And I think just in the first 3 days of September, 20 bars and restaurants went under for good permanently. And so we're seeing like, these eateries just dropping like flies out in NYC. And we still have Cuomo saying like, well, we can't quite reopen now until we get this like, social distancing enforcement squad. And, who knows how long that's going to take and how much work that's going to be to set up.
Right. Well, and then also, I've seen nobody question this, but like we have this massive movement going on right now, in part, focused on defund the police, but certainly to look at revamping the role of police and not having the police in so many confrontations. If the police are going to be showing up at every business and going around and you're not wearing a mask and you're not social distance or whatever, inciting or arresting people, that seems like you're going to put your officers in a whole lot of confrontation with people that, in the other sense, you have an entire movement like specifically out there to stop from happening. And again, like of all the things going on, it is shocking to me that nobody is just a little bit outraged about that. That we're, after we have like this whole social justice, we need to rein in the police thing. This guy is going to go send 4,000 police or however many he wants to send out there to enforce arbitrary rules around wearing a mask. And, then of course it's going to get ugly. We had this situation in Rochester, New York. You got that guy, David Perdue, right? So now you're arresting people who aren't following COVID rules. So what, you're going to be putting beds over their heads like you did David Perdue to stop the, spread of COVID? That doesn't look very good, obviously. I mean, that's, a huge part of why people are so upset about what happened to that guy. Was because it just looked so damn ugly because they put a bag over his head before they suffocated him. So I'm not sure, like, what the hell he thinks is going to happen or why he wants to set up this task force. It's really shocking. And like, as you point out, they have all these arbitrary rules. I remember at one point I was tweeting with Bob Murphy about, whether you're allowed to have boneless wings or bone-in wings, because a boneless wing is just a chicken nugget. Is that really a meal? But bone-in wing maybe is. He said sandwiches are okay at one point, I think, which didn't make sense because you eat it with your hands. You think you want something maybe you eat with a fork and a knife so you're not sticking things in your mouth. But
right.
It's all arbitrary. It's all stupid. And so many people are blindly complying with it. Pete Quinones has been taking quite a few victory laps about saying that, people would still be wearing masks like 6 or 8 months after this thing happened. And I mean, it certainly looks like a lot of this stuff is here to stay, and these arbitrary rules in New York City and, this massive police force that I'm sure is going to be just like the one they have in Australia, running around and rounding up pregnant women for what they put on Facebook is a terrifying state. And this guy is the liberal reformer to the law and order president.
Right. That's right. So that's the situation. There's one possible saving grace here that like the city council speaker, Corey Johnson, I think the guy's name is. He's saying that like, look, we agree that we have to have some kind of, social distancing enforcement. He's like, but we don't want to use the NYPD for that, man. Like just with everything that's going on, like I think he at least recognizes the potential for that to be a disaster. So this guy might be our saving grace here. One of these city officials in New York who might get hopefully a different non-police power agency that's not going to show up with guns to maybe do this kind of inspection stuff. I would prefer they didn't do it at all, but if they're going to do it, I'd rather than not send the cops.
Right. Yeah. At least a little bit less confrontation with cops. Well, Will, is there anything we didn't cover that you had on your mind today, or is that pretty much knock it out? Of course, if you have any other like COVID updates, I'd be interested to just hear how things are going in your little area of the world, if the hospitals are overrun or if things are still locked down or how that's going.
Yeah, I gotta, so we can talk a little bit more broad COVID stuff, I think. Like, I have not certainly been following the trends as closely as I was a couple months ago in like the real peak of the outbreak during like March and April and stuff. But like, yeah, if you go and look at the graph, it does seem like we're mostly past this like spike in cases we saw over the summer. Like if you look at like the daily case numbers, it seems like they are falling. And deaths, I don't think really ever, like nationwide, deaths did not spike up with that new spike in cases, like nowhere near what the cases were suggesting. Here in Michigan, we do still have like slightly higher daily case numbers than we did earlier in the year. Like in June, I think that was like our lowest number since the outbreak began. So things are kind of falling, it looks like, nationwide. However, there was one story I wanted to mention in particular that I think people should go take a look at, in the New York Times, actually, the other day. There's been a lot of question about just like whether the testing data is accurate, whether it's giving too many false positives or false negatives, and what these numbers really mean. I mean, I know there's reports, I think, in the Atlantic actually, of this about this how the CDC is mixing its data. It started randomly mixing its like RNA testing and antibody testing. And so there's been all kinds of things that just suggest like this data is kind of weird and mixed and not that helpful. And now the Times has the story where it's kind of even further suggesting that, where they're kind of looking at the sensitivity of tests, and they're finding that a lot of tests are, in the U.S. at least, are finding like really, really tiny, minuscule amounts of virus, and they're being flagged as positive. And they're saying how like this at this amount, like people won't get sick from the virus and they can't pass it on. It's not contagious. And so they're questioning whether it even really is right to call that a positive test, positive like confirmed infection,
or
because
it's
of how
certainly
sensitive.
not the same thing as somebody having coronavirus in what we think it is. It's distinctly different.
Right, like it's not even so much like an asymptomatic thing, like where like you have the thing, but for some reason it's not giving you symptoms. Like you're asymptomatic because it's such a small amount of virus, it couldn't possibly make you sick, and you can't pass it on to people. And so they're saying that they went back and looked, because like the Times is sort of saying this might be an issue, and so we went back and looked at data for New York State and Massachusetts, and they found that 90% of the positive tests had that like minuscule, insignificant amount of virus in it. And so they're kind of like, that could suggest that like we're really overstating the number of infections, and like infections in the sense of somebody who should be quarantining and who can pass it on to others. And so I found this Times piece to be very interesting. Like this is just for 2 states they looked at, but like if you extrapolate that out, 90% is like, that's a lot of cases. That's the most of the outbreak, it seems.
Right.
And so it seems like that could be a big deal.
And they may be states that are a little bit worse on that, just because I know there are states that were hit early, and so maybe later tests have gotten better. Maybe they've gotten worse. I don't know. I also know like a big issue that I have seen with the data is that sometimes it lags, or sometimes they input like backlogged data. And so I think there was a case in Texas where like they had like a spike one day of like a bunch of cases in a county. Well, it was that like they had all these tests from May that they either didn't look at, didn't get to, or something like that, and then they reported them in June. And so like on the Johns Hopkins or the whatever world metrics that most people look at, it looked like there was a significant spike, but that doesn't reflect the accurate like what's happening on the ground there. Everybody right now is all focused on this 94% number, where
Right.
that percentage of people had like mostly 2 or more comorbidities when they died with or of coronavirus. Now, that doesn't mean that 94% of the people had a stroke, and then they test and they found a small number of coronavirus viruses and labeled it positive. But you do have to wonder, like with what you're saying, if it's just a small amount, like all these people with 2 or more comorbidities, how many of those people actually didn't even have a amount of coronavirus that was spreadable, much less that was going to be anything that could possibly kill them. And so
Right.
yeah, and all this is very important. Look, there's a lot of people that have had to put off significant life events, people who have missed out. You see people on Twitter say that my wife's going in for a procedure today and I can't be there with her. My wife had a baby, I couldn't be there. I'm thinking things from like a men's perspective. Somebody's mother passes away and you can't go to the funeral because you test positive, or there's not a funeral. Like that kind of stuff has happened to a lot of people. And so for getting that wrong, then that's something that people should know, because we really need to start reassessing how we're looking at this virus and reacting to it. And I mean, certainly what we're putting these kids through. The virtual learning isn't enough. People who saw the news ticker, the video feed on today's show, I have the one on there about a 12-year-old boy in Colorado getting suspended from school because his teacher saw him flash a toy gun on it. All these things are happening because of our reaction to COVID. And they may not seem all that serious, but I'm sure they're saying a little boy brought a gun to school, that's going to stick with him for a long time. And,
Right.
that could result in a very, very long suspension from school. And just anybody out there that's listening that's a parent, schools are interpreting that as bringing a gun to school. Like they're saying
Yeah.
it's the same thing as bringing a physical gun to the building, which means they will take your kids for that kind of stuff. So,
Yeah,
just.
they sent like people to his house to do police, I think, sent this to,
Mhm,
I think it was an African American boy, sent cops to his house to do a welfare check,
mhm.
which is like, yeah, and saying, oh, he might have a gun or something. Like, that's a great, precedent.
Right. Yeah. Little boy had I think a bow and arrow on his wall behind him. They said that was bringing a gun to school.
Right.
Just if you're a parent, be careful because the teachers are looking into like your homes now. And if they see something that they feel like they shouldn't see, they all have to like sign these things that say, yes, I will report it. If you're a teacher in almost every state, you're what's called a mandated reporter. So if you witness
Yeah.
anything that you believe is even potential abuse, you're required by law to report it. So this is creating all kinds of problems and much more serious stuff than this. But that was something I know a little bit about and want to talk about. Anyways, Will, anything else on COVID, or should we wrap it for today? And we'll have another great show for Wednesday.
No, I think I would encourage people to go check out. Maybe we can leave it in the show notes. That Times story,
Oh
like I
yeah.
thought it was pretty good. The Times has done some decent work on the COVID stuff, as long as it's not real. There's no political element to it or something, and you're not talking about anonymous sources or whatever. Like, they've done some decent work, so that one's worth checking out, I think.
All right. Well, all right. Everybody, check out Will Porter on Twitter at the Will Porter. He writes for our